Good afternoon. The subcommittee will come to order. Thank you all for being here today for this oversight hearing on revolving funds at the Department of Veteran Affairs. A revolving fund is essentially a business run by a federal agency under authority granted by Congress. The revolving fund contains enterprises that provide services and collect fees. Instead of the typical model where Congress provides appropriations to pay federal employees to perform tasks, the revolving fund is supposed to be self-supporting. A fund can recoup its costs and even make a profit, which goes into its reserves. That is supposed to be competitive and economical, but in practice it tends to be less transparent. VA has two large revolving funds, the Franchise Fund and the Supply Fund, and many other smaller funds. The enterprises in the Franchise Fund provide accounting, payments, debt collection, human resources, IT, law enforcement training, and other services. The enterprises in the Supply Fund are distribution centers and contracting offices that sell products like hearing aids, medical equipment, and burial flags, and put in place contracts that other offices can order against. The revolving funds are big business for VA, and they seem to be steadily expanding. Each fund took in revenue of about $1.8 billion last year, but they don't disclose key information. VA publishes the Franchise Fund's annual report, but the Supply Fund's financial statements are not public. These documents don't include basic facts like how much individual enterprises made or lost or how much a fund drew from its reserves. The committee discovered the Supply Fund ran a $37 million loss last year, but the financial statements characterized it as a profit. I hope you can see why I'm concerned this is not transparency. It has also been a struggle to get information on VA's agreement with the Department of Homeland Security, or ICE, to process payments to local healthcare providers who treat detained illegal immigrants. But after several months of Chairman Boss asking questions, VA did provide the agreement last week. Now that we have been able to read it, several things have become clear. The VA has been processing the medical claims for illegal immigrants for ICE since 2002. ICE pays VA for the healthcare claims as well as fees to cover VA's administrative costs and a profit. The agreement actually covers a half dozen different services related to processing the claims. VA collected at least $124 million from ICE in 2023 through their agreement. And the VA officials who run the Franchise Fund consider these profits very important. These revolving funds have been steadily adding and expanding business lines over the year, growing their revenues and their payrolls. There's clearly an incentive to grow the funds, but they don't always turn a profit. We discovered that several enterprises within the Franchise Fund have suffered losses in recent years, and the Supply Fund as a whole took a loss last year. The Canteen Fund had to be bailed out for $140 million during the pandemic. Congress would not know any of that if not for this hearing. Revolving funds may be an effective way to provide services, but they also seem to be a blind spot. Like any other business, they can be mismanaged or suffer downturns. We always need to know how they are performing. We need to ensure that VA is not creating new enterprises for the sake of empire building, but signing these agreements carefully. I appreciate our witnesses joining us today to answer these important questions. With that, I now recognize Ranking Member Mervan for his opening comments.
Thank you, Chair Kiggins. I appreciate the opportunity to learn more about VA revolving funds today. Revolving funds are not unique to VA. They are used across federal agencies. Congress authorized revolving funds to help the government run more efficiently. So I want to go ahead and answer the question this hearing title poses. Are veterans being shortchanged by VA revolving funds? From my read of the testimony and other materials my staff compiled ahead of this hearing, no veterans are not being shortchanged. In fact, veterans are benefiting from the VA revolving funds program. As we will hear today, the use of the VA revolving funds results in government efficiencies and cost savings that allow VA to focus on what it does best, care for veterans. VA is able to reinvest the profits from its revolving funds directly into technology advances benefiting VA and the veterans it serves. VA revolving funds are subject to significant oversight. The Revolving Funds Board of Directors provides strategic leadership and ensures accountability and transparency for this program. Annual independent audits are performed on the funds, and VA has received 16 consecutive clean audits for Supply Fund and 26 for Franchise Fund. The Anti-Deficiency Act also mandates that the fund does not incur costs or make payments that exceed the amounts available in the funds. These guardrails help ensure the revolving funds operate in the way Congress intended. I was impressed to hear about the wide range of goods and services the revolving fund provides through the supply and franchise funds, all while being fiscally responsible. VA's enterprise centers operated through the franchise fund provided administrative services in the areas of IT, financial management, personal security, and law enforcement, and human resources. These programs boost productivity and minimize cost. This is a prime example of good governance. I want to address recent claims made in the media in regard to the VA's revolving funds. VA and the Department of Homeland Security have had a fee-for-service partnership authorized through the VA Franchise Fund for nearly 2 decades, specifically between ICE Health Services Corp. And VA's Financial Service Center. Since 2002, IHSC and FSC have operated independently with appropriate congressional oversight under multiple Republican and Democratic administrations alike. VA has repeatedly informed the public and Congress that it does not provide or fund health care services for ICE detainees. ICE is solely responsible for determining a patient's eligibility for care, helping them access care in private sector, and transmitting bills for processing to FSC. In this relationship, VA is solely responsible for administrative tasks which are reimbursed by IHSC. The argument that this takes away key manpower from processing veterans' claims is blatantly false and intended to incite outrage against VA and migrant communities. In fact, if the VA were to end this partnership and work, it would likely result in enormous cost and administrative burden to the federal government, as they would have to contract with private company to process these bills. The only way veterans could be shortchanged here is if my colleagues push to remove this successful and efficient revenue-building program at VA. Instead of politicizing the facts of a successful VA operation, we should focus on the real positive outcomes of VA revolving funds. I hope my colleagues across the aisle also look at this hearing as an opportunity to learn more about a program in government that is working well. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mervan. We will now turn to witness testimony. Testifying before us today on our first panel, we have Ms. Terry Raffel, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Financial Management Business Transformation at the Department of Veteran Affairs. She's accompanied by Mr. Leroy Larkins, Executive Director of the VA Office of Revolving Funds, Mr. Philip Christie, the Deputy Executive Director of the VA Office of Acquisition, Logistics, and Construction. Finally, we have Ms. Julie Mata, Deputy General Counsel at the Government Accountability Office. Thank you and welcome. Will the witnesses please stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witness has answered in the affirmative. Ms. Raffel, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to provide your testimony.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Kiggins, Ranking Member Mervan, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Department of Veterans Affairs VA revolving funds and how these funds support VA's mission to care for veterans, their families, caregivers, and survivors. I'm accompanied by Leroy Larkins, Executive Director for Revolving Funds, and Philip Christie, Deputy Executive Director for Acquisitions, Logistics, and Construction. The VA revolving funds, consisting of the Supply Fund and Franchise Fund, provide high-quality, cost-effective support services by streamlining processes, optimizing the value of common administrative services to VA administrations and staff offices, as well as other government agencies. Shared service offerings allow VA revolving fund customers to focus on performing their mission-critical functions of providing high-quality care, benefits, and services to veterans and eligible family members. Better support to VA employees for common administrative services means better service for veterans, their families, caregivers, and survivors. VA is proud to serve as a federal shared service provider. I'd like to highlight a few examples where the Supply Fund and Franchise Fund have successfully improved services to VA, enhancing support to our veterans. The Financial Services Center, the FSC, has consolidated 78 field payroll offices to the FSC. As a result, VHA and VBA can redirect resources to focus on their core mission of caring for veterans and family members. Additionally, the FSC reduced the backlog of veteran non-community care network medical claims by 99% and achieved a 92% auto-adjudication rate for dialysis medical claims with an average of 1.6 processing days. These efforts resulted in significant improvement in VA provider relations, directly supporting veterans' ability to receive medical care. The Supply Fund Board organizations, which provide strategic contracting, have delivered over $3 billion in cost avoidance since 2020 due to robust category management principles and board-approved business plans. Oversight for the VA revolving funds is conducted through the Revolving Fund Board of Directors, which functions as the principal governance body overseeing the Supply Fund and Franchise Fund's strategic priorities, goals, and objectives. It also provides strategic leadership for the Supply and Franchise Fund's operations, execution, and management of overall risks and challenges. The Revolving Fund Board of Directors is co-chaired by the Deputy Chief Financial Officer and Deputy Chief Acquisition Officer of the department, with board members consisting of 6 other senior leaders from VA administrations and staff offices, whose participation on the Revolving Fund Board of Directors ensures revolving fund resources strategically serve VA's mission. To emphasize transparency and accountability for a $2.2 billion budget, each Franchise Fund, Enterprise Center, and Supply Fund Acquisition Center is required to complete a 2-year business plan on an annual basis. The Revolving Fund Board of Directors reviews and approves each business plan, which details specific revenue and expense projections, full-time equivalent staffing levels, and contract support requirements prior to funds execution. Information from the approved business plans is utilized to develop budget summary data and is included in Part 5 of the VA President's budget submission. VA revolving fund financial statements are audited by a private sector public accounting firm annually to provide an independent assessment of each revolving fund's financial stewardship. As a result of sound financial management business practices, the Franchise Fund received 26 and Supply Fund 16 consecutive unmodified clean opinions. In closing, the VA revolving funds provide shared services to meet customer service demands effectively and efficiently, providing significant benefit to VA administrations and staff offices as well as other government agencies. As the Government Accountability Office noted in a recent report, GAO 23-104-624, on a similar function in another agency, given the fiscal pressures facing the federal government, consolidating and sharing services such as payroll or information technology services within and among agencies is one way agencies can operate more efficiently. Shared services may also allow agencies to benefit from economies of scale and take advantage of specialized expertise. VA's revolving funds adhere to this principle and are consistent with GAO's recommendation. Madam Chairwoman and other members of the subcommittee, thank you again for the opportunity to discuss VA's revolving funds. This concludes my opening statement, and my colleagues and I are happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Rafael. Ms. Mata, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to provide your testimony.
Chairwoman Kiggins, Ranking Member Mervan, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss some of the key features of revolving funds, including how they are established, revolving fund types, and the applicability of key appropriations law principles. I'm pleased to be able to share some of GAO's expertise in appropriations law on this topic. I'd like to begin with the fundamental nature of a revolving fund as a form of appropriation. As the name suggests, a revolving fund is intended to finance a cycle of operations. To accomplish that purpose, revolving funds collect and retain receipts that are then used to finance the fund's operations. Thus, revolving funds are exceptions to the miscellaneous receipts statute. This law requires an agency to deposit any funds it receives outside of congressional appropriations into the appropriate general fund of the U.S. Treasury, unless the agency is otherwise authorized to retain and use the funds. revolving funds provide such an authorization. The structure of a revolving fund is similar to that of a business. One of the advantages of this structure is that the fund may become self-sustaining through its cycle of operations. If that happens, the activities supported by the revolving fund may no longer need annual appropriations from Congress. This gives the agency more flexibility, but it may also reduce the routine congressional visibility into the fund's operations that the annual appropriations cycle provides. The flexibility provided by a revolving fund is not unlimited. Importantly, the amounts in a revolving fund are appropriated, including both the initial infusion of working capital and the operating receipts generated by the fund itself. This has two significant consequences for the revolving fund. First, revolving funds can only be created by Congress because only Congress can make an appropriation. Agencies have no authority to administratively create a revolving fund. Instead, an agency may only operate such a fund where Congress has provided specific statutory authority. That statutory authority will specify the receipts that may be deposited into the fund and the purposes for which those receipts may be used. Second, the rules that guide the use of appropriations apply to revolving funds as well. We often think about appropriations laws having three fundamental characteristics: purpose, time, and amount. The purpose statute provides that appropriations can only be used for the purposes for which they were made. Revolving funds then may only be used for the purposes specified in the legislation authorizing the fund. With respect to time, revolving funds have a special characteristic. One of the defining features of a revolving fund is that the receipts earned by the fund are available without fiscal year limitation. This means that the receipts can be used to purchase goods and services that the fund needs at any time. By contrast, most annual appropriations are available only for those goods and services an agency needs during a fixed period of time. Finally, with respect to amount, perhaps the most important fiscal statute is the Anti-Deficiency Act. This law prohibits agencies from spending more than is appropriated to them and from spending amounts before they receive them. As a result, a revolving fund may not spend more than the amount contained in the fund, and receipts cannot be spent until they are collected. Revolving funds are also subject to other legal requirements that apply to appropriated amounts. For example, obligations made against any appropriation must be recorded. An obligation is a legal requirement to make a payment, and the recording statute requires agencies to document their obligations, keeping track of how much has already been spent. Importantly, only those obligations that meet certain statutory criteria can be recorded. These requirements ensure that the obligations incurred by a revolving fund are proper and within the fund's means. Revolving funds strike a balance between agency flexibility and congressional control of the public purse. They provide a way to finance cyclical agency operations that may become self-sustaining, while remaining subject to the restrictions that apply to all appropriated funds. Chairwoman Kiggins, Ranking Member Mervan, and members of the committee, this completes my prepared statement. I am pleased to respond to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to questions, and I yield myself 5 minutes. Ms. Mata, what benefit do revolving funds produce, and is the purpose to provide services in the most economical way possible or to turn a profit for the agency?
GAO's longstanding case law looking at revolving funds as a form of appropriation talks about a couple flexibilities with revolving funds, primarily that they are no longer part of the annual appropriation cycle. They're a form of permanent appropriation, and typically the amounts in the revolving fund are no year. They're provided to the agency without fiscal year limitations. So that provides the agency a certain amount of flexibility. It's a loosening of the congressional purse strings, if you would. We would, if GAO were looking at a particular revolving fund, look at the exact language of the statute. Revolving funds can differ and may give an agency more or less flexibility to retain a balance. Some revolving funds specify an amount that must be returned to the Treasury. So GAO would look at the language of the statute because each revolving fund requires a specific authorization.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Riffle, you explained in a briefing to staff that the profits generated by the franchise fund are very important to the VA. Where do the profits go, and what would be the consequences of losing them?
Yeah, so they are very important. So they go into retained earnings. And in those retained earnings, we have operational reserves as well as capital reserves. Operational reserves are there in case we were to lose a customer and we have to all of a sudden bear additional costs with no income. We would have that to fall back on. The capital reserve is also used to provide for technology enhancements or improvements. A customer may come to us with a new requirement. We would leverage our reserves to support quick delivery of that customer's requirements. That's part really of the whole idea behind shared services, that an agency and or a customer internal to VA may have a specific business need. They're not able to meet that business need. They can come to us. If it's a common administrative service that we offer, we would certainly do what we need to on demand meet that customer's need. Those reserves are critical for us to be able to do that. If we were to lose this customer, or lose a customer in general, anytime a business loses a customer, then you obviously have less profit, less reserves, and you have to determine what you're going to do with the individuals that were performing that duty that's no longer there, which also becomes a burden to the, in this case, a franchise organization.
Thank you. And Ms. Mata, what happens when there's a shortfall in a revolving fund?
The Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits agencies from incurring expenses in excess of the amount in a fund. So an agency is legally prohibited from incurring additional expenses if they don't have amounts to cover it.
Thank you. Mr. Larkins, how many times in the last 3 years has one of the funds or one of their enterprises produced a loss, and how did you make up that shortfall?
Thank you for the question. For the supply fund, we've seen that in 2 years of the last 5 years. It was in 2020 and then 2023. We've seen that. Also in the franchise fund, we have only one instance, and that was back in 2022 for our law enforcement training center. And so each time we're able to utilize the reserves to compensate for those particular losses.
Thank you. And Mr. Larkins, how much money is in the fund's reserve, and how much has been drawn down over the last 3 years?
Okay, thank you for that. In the franchise fund, we have a total reserve of, I want to say, $678 million, which consists of operating reserves of $521 million and $157 million in capital reserves. For the supply fund, we have a total of $424 million in the reserve.
Thank you. And Ms. Mata, the VA publishes the franchise fund financial statements, but the supply fund financial statements are not made public. Neither of them contain much information about the fund's reserve or the profits or losses of enterprises within the funds. Does this lack of transparency present any risks?
The Anti-Deficiency Act and the recording statute both require agencies to keep track of receipts and the expenses on any form of appropriation, including a revolving fund. The VA should be able to provide this committee with those statements at the level of detail that you require for your oversight at any time.
Thank you, and my time has expired. I will now yield 5 minutes to Ranking Member Mervan.
Ms. Riffle.
I want to give you the opportunity to set the record straight on the relationship between the VA and the Department of Homeland Security. Please share the facts that you think are relevant to dispel any of the misinformation in the media relating to this issue.
I really appreciate the opportunity to respond to that question. I think there's been a lot of mischaracterization in the media around the Financial Services Center's relationship with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, particularly Health Services Corps. I want to make it really clear that there's no VA funds nor VA healthcare professionals that provide any services to those individuals that are in the custody of ICE. Never have. We've been doing this for over 20 years, and the relationship is solely to process medical claims, and IHSC pre-funds or advance funds the VA or the Financial Services Center for that work. And that's really how simple it is.
From a cost savings and economies of scale perspective, why does it make sense for the VA to process these bills?
Yeah, so it's because the skill to process healthcare claims is actually fairly unique. And the Financial Services Center does this service for Veterans Health Administration and also for this other government agency, IHSC. And I think part of the efficiency is that through economies of scale, we're able to actually spread the overhead that's necessary to be able to perform this service. And it benefits VA because IHSC is actually absorbing some of that overhead in that product line overall, that medical claims processing product line. So I think it's a good example of shared services across government where you have more than one agency that's benefiting from a shared service offering that, in this case, the Financial Services Center as part of VA is able to deliver.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Larkin, thank you for sharing the information about the VA revolving funds. This is certainly an interesting program and clearly a benefit to the VA, the federal government, and taxpayers. How have the revolving funds been instrumental in enhancing operational efficiencies within government programs? What specific examples can you provide that highlight the benefits of utilizing revolving funds in promoting fiscal responsibility and sustainability resource management?
No, thank you for the opportunity to speak about the value of shared services, specifically the VA revolving funds. When I think about the work that we do across the 8 enterprise centers within the franchise fund, one item actually sticks out to me from the Internal Control Servicing Center, who provides reviews of state and tribal government-operated veteran cemeteries. What we want to do is make sure that they are maintaining the standards that NCA has been known for. They got a 97 score related to the American Customer Satisfaction Index, and so we want to make sure that we take that off their plate so they can concentrate on serving the VA cemeteries, but at the same time, we want to make sure that these state cemeteries are up to standard. And so we do this, and I think that this is something that's personal to me because my father, who is a U.S. Army Vietnam veteran, actually has pre-selected a state cemetery for his final burial place for him and my mother. And so for me, I want to make sure that they are getting the standards that they're up to. And so we talk about the duality of shared services, the efficiencies that are there, but we're actually taking care of the veteran as well. When we think about on the supply fund side of the house, one of the programs that sticks out to me is the Warriors to Workforce program that's conducted from the VA Acquisitions Academy. This 7-month program actually trains service-disabled veterans and actually trains them to be contract specialists. And so literally we are using our resources to train veterans to improve their lives. And actually this is a shared service training resource where we've trained 264 interns across the federal government. 44 actually are from other government agencies.
And quickly, we've got about 30 seconds. You had mentioned that there's $678 million in that fund. Can you tell me, is that those programs that you mentioned, that fund is utilized for that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
With that, I yield back. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Mervan. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rosendale for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs has 2 major revolving funds, the Franchise Fund and the Supply Fund, that provide services to VA offices and other agencies on a fee-for-service basis. Both do not receive annual appropriations from Congress and instead operate like a business. While I'm glad these revolving funds do not add to our over $34 trillion debt, the funding mechanism has largely prevented Congress from providing proper oversight. The lack of oversight has led to confusion about how the funds are used, and I'm hopeful that this hearing today can clear that up. Ms. Rafael, several processing functions have been improved by turning them over to FCS, as you talked about. Don't disagree with that. But I do have some questions about some of those other practices that you all have taken on, whether it was by choice or not. The U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement allocated $75 million in fiscal year 2021 and $124 million in fiscal year 2023 for illegal immigrants in ICE detention to receive health care services on the taxpayer's dime. This 65% increase is the direct result of Biden's refusal to secure the southern border. Ms. Rafael, where do the dollars come from to pay the health care providers who treat the ICE detainees?
Yeah, thanks for that question. As I stated earlier, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, IHSC, pre-funds for both the FTE that are dedicated for that particular claims processing service, as well as for the disbursements to reimburse those providers that are doing that care.
So this is coming directly from ICE's budget then?
That's correct.
Okay. Ms. Rafael, who are the healthcare providers who treat the illegal immigrants detained by ICE?
Yeah, I would actually, so ICE has responsibility for that coordination of care for anybody in their custody. VA does not get involved with that. So we're simply processing claims on behalf of IHSC. We're not involved whatsoever in where or how those individuals in custody are receiving care.
So I understand that the care is provided by non-VA providers.
That's correct.
Okay. Is it possible that the same healthcare providers who are part of the VA's community care network could also be the same providers who treat the illegal immigrants that are detained by ICE?
Yeah, there's no analysis to indicate one way or the other on that. That's not part of any of the agreement that we have with IHSC in terms of asking for any of that information.
So you're not privy to any of that information?
So we don't analyze.
I didn't ask if you analyzed it. So you are privy to, you have access to the information that shows the healthcare providers that they're utilizing because you're processing their collections and payments.
We're processing payments to providers that.
Okay, so then you know who the providers are that they're using.
Yes.
Okay, so again, the same healthcare providers who are part of the VA's community care network could also be the same providers who treat the illegal immigrants detained by ICE.
Again, we have not done that analysis to.
I didn't ask you if you
confirm.
did the analysis. I said, could they be the same care providers?
We would have to confirm that. I don't want to say
Is it
yes or
possible?
no.
Is it possible?
I would like to take that for the record and answer
You don't know if it's
accurately.
possible if healthcare is being delivered in the same communities that we have a veterans community, and you have access to because of the fact you have to pay them, you can't say whether that would even be possible.
I would rather.
I mean, you're not
accurately
looking
answer
good
the
to the
question.
American people right now, okay, the way you're trying to evade this. It's a pretty simple question.
Well, I appreciate your question. We have not.
You just won't
looked
answer.
at
Okay,
that.
okay. This arrangement could result in illegal immigrants receiving treatment before our veterans do. And quite frankly, to this committee, that's completely unacceptable. Do you think it's fair?
Not aware of that.
Do you think it's fair if that is taking place? If we have illegal immigrants that are utilizing the same community care providers that our veterans are supposed to be utilizing, and it's keeping our veterans from receiving their care, do you think that that is fair?
That's an assertion that.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
What can you show me that proves they are not the same networks and that illegal immigrants are not being prioritized over veterans? Can you provide me that information?
We can take that for the record if that's something that.
I would like to see that. I would absolutely like to see that. Madam Chair, I see I'm 12 seconds over. I would yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. The chair now recognizes Mr. Pappas for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, and I appreciate members of the panel for your comments here this morning. And I think it's critically important that, the way that you have reinforced the argument about VA being laser focused on its mission to deliver care and benefits to the veterans of this country, and we appreciate that. I think at a time where we're seeing a historic expansion of care and benefits through the PACT Act, more than 5 million American veterans have been screened for toxic exposure, for instance. Veterans should have no question about the ability of VA to be there for them. And I think any sort of political narrative that's ginned up to try to sow doubt among veterans is dangerous and is counterproductive to the work that is ongoing at VA. I did appreciate the way that you highlighted the benefits of these programs. I learned a few things today. I did hear Ms. Riffle, you talking about the Financial Services Center and the way that it has played a role in terms of paying claims through the community care program. It's something that I've heard a lot about over the years in my district. A lot of providers that are out there, a few years ago in particular, were dealing with a huge backlog of legacy claims. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you've worked with the provider community to make sure ultimately that the bill is paid and that these folks continue to be there to be able to provide care to our veterans.
Yeah, so thanks for that. And we've had a relationship with Veterans Health Administration for quite some time in terms of supporting their claims processing, particularly around the Camp Lejeune Family Member Program, as well as the contracted dialysis claims, and then the community care non-network claims. So we're not associated with the contract that they have right now, but the other ones. And I would tell you that we were instrumental in helping them with their initial backlog that they had several years back that resulted in some concerns from the private sector community. And so we feel really honored to partner with them and to be able to really help those relations that they needed to ensure that veterans are getting the care they need to in the field. So we continue to this day to have that relationship with VHA and certainly would stand by to support any additional claims that they need us to do for them. 95% of our medical claims processing that we do is in support of VHA. Only really 5% is OGA. So again, our big focus is for Veterans Health Administration.
Oh, we thank you for that, and I've seen the benefit on the ground in my district in terms of the relationship between providers and VA and the way that they work for veterans. I want to highlight another program and the way that it supports VA's work, and that's around VA's police force. I understand that the Revolving Funds program led to the creation of the Law Enforcement Training Center. It provides special training for police officers working in healthcare environments, which is a pretty specific environment, including law enforcement personnel working at VA healthcare facilities. And so I'm wondering maybe, Mr. Larkins, if you want to take this one, can you share how LETC trains VA police officers and fosters a safe environment for veterans seeking care at VA?
No, thank you for this opportunity. It's some great work that's being done at the Law Enforcement Training Center. Specifically, they have a mandate to train our VA police officers, very specialized training. We want to make sure that if a veteran's in crisis or an emergent situation happens, that we maintain respect for the veteran's rights and the things that they've earned over time. You know, things happen, but we want to make sure that we're able to de-escalate the situation quickly, right, and get voluntary adherence to what the police officer is asking. And so they've been carrying out this mission now since, I want to say 2007, and they've been doing a great job for that, for this time frame.
Well, thank you all for helping us to understand the bigger picture in terms of these revolving funds. We look forward to receiving more information, staying up to date so that we can do our oversight work. And with that, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Pappas. And we will now proceed to round 2 of questions, and I will yield 5 minutes to myself. Ms. Riffle, the VA has described the ICE agreement as processing healthcare claims. However, based on the documents you provided last week, there is a lot more to it. Can you walk me through the full scope of these services?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So there's some ancillary services that happen when you process medical claims, so like some mailroom stuff and some of the help desk activities in terms of answering inquiries and whatnot. So those certainly, we didn't call those out directly initially, but they are called out in the agreement with ICE. The other main service that's provided is purchase card services. So you would see that on there as well. Other than that, the other ancillary are really secondary to supporting the medical claims processing product line, which is the main product line that we have with them.
And then additionally, Ms. Rafael, according to the VA spokesman, not more than 10 VA staff perform this work for ICE. Is this just counting the VA federal employees, or does that number also include contractors?
No, federal employees. Those are FTE.
Okay. And let's see, so also, did these positions exist in the VA prior to the ICE agreement, or were they created to work on the agreement?
So that's been, 20 plus years ago. So I think over the years, initially when we first started, we had some contractors involved, but as we've gotten very specialized skill in that area now, we've switched over to FTE so that we can actually maintain some continuity and standards in that particular product line.
Okay. And then, let's see, in 2021, the administration reassigned most of the community care claims processing from the FSC to the newly created Integrated Veterans Care Office. As the FSC processes more and more medical claims for ICE and fewer veteran community care claims, how is this ICE agreement benefiting veterans or the community care program? Ms. Ruffalo.
So again, I want to just reiterate that 95% of our claims processing is for Veterans Health Administration. Only 5% is represented by OGA. And I think it really is shared services in general, right? You have that opportunity to create efficiencies, economies of scale by spreading your overhead amongst more than one customer. So it benefits VA as well as us maintaining the skill that we need to be able to perform that for any other agency, really, that might come to us and request that service.
One last question. Committee staff asked the VA this question prior to the hearing, but we did not receive an answer. Do you know how many revolving funds there are in the VA at all levels?
Yeah, I'll actually defer that to Mr. Larkins here.
Yes, we have more than a dozen VA revolving funds that are there, and we're working on now trying to compile the information, and we'll get it to you soon.
That would be great, thank you. And I will yield to Mr. Mervan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mrs. Matta, are there best practices used in other federal agencies the VA could adopt to increase transparency for the revolving funds to address some of the concerns we hear today?
Ranking Member Mervan, I can provide an answer for the record for you on that. Our experts back at GAO who do engagements, looking at the operations of specific funds, can work with your staff and give you some of that information.
Mr. Larkins, I was pleased to hear about the clean audit history of the VA Franchise Fund. Can you please describe how audits and general oversight of the fund is conducted?
No, I'm sorry.
And what are the guardrails to ensure the fund remains fiscally responsible?
No, thank you for that. Each year, we have a public accounting firm come in to do an assessment of our financial statements, and they actually produce an audit report on our behalf, and they go through an exhaustive list of controls over a period of about 6 months, and they come to an opinion. We've, just as mentioned before, we have 26 consecutive clean opinions for the franchise funds, 16 for the supply fund. In addition to that, we actually have other internal controls within VA to make sure that, again, we're not going to exhaust the revolving fund. One of the things that my colleague has helped stand up is the IFAM system, and there are controls within that system that are going to prevent us from, overspending what's actually in the reserve. And so there's many controls set up. There's actually monthly monitoring of budget execution to make sure that the plan that's been laid out, these 2-year business plans that we talked about before, are actually being executed properly. So there's many controls in place to make sure that we stay fiscally sound.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mervan. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rosendale for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Larkins, as a former Montana Insurance Commissioner, I do understand the need and the purpose for having reserves available to you, but I just did some quick math, and the your organization has 2,500 employees, roughly, and if we just average that, you have $100,000 a year salary across the board. Sure, some make more, some make less. That's about $250 million a year of obligation, of true obligation that you have. Let's throw some benefits in there, some bonus payments, whatever goes on, and round it up to $300 million. If you have $300 million of true obligation and you're sitting on a balance of your reserves is at $1.64 billion. Wait a second, $1.2 billion, excuse me, $1.2 billion in accumulated reserves. That is 4 times the amount that is truly, totally obligated. The balance of your $164 billion that I'm showing, $164 billion is your cost going out, $100.8 billion revenue coming in, okay? So this is your in and out numbers. That's truly an exercise of the books that you're handling for other people. And if there is a change in that, there's going to be a equal change in the obligation that goes out. So your true obligation is about $250 to $300 million a year. And so why I'm asking is that at $1.2 billion of accumulated reserves, you're talking about 4 years worth of time, and you would certainly be able to modify your business plan, your business model in a year's time if there was that dramatic of a change. And so I just don't understand why this organization has a requirement for such a high reserve amount. I'm not sure who's best equipped to answer this question, so this question is for whoever may be able to take it up. I want to ask you about another revolving fund. It's the Pershing Hall in Paris. Pershing Hall was purchased and organized by a group of World War I veterans and American Legion members as a memorial and gathering place. Since then, it's been turned over to the VA. It's become dilapidated and renovated several times, and most recently leased to a hotel and then to a shoe store. Today, VA collects the rent and is allowed to spend a portion of it on receptions. According to the Legion members in Paris, it no longer serves any public purpose, and its collection of historical artifacts has been scattered. Are you aware of this situation? Anybody? And do you think this revolving fund has mutated into a pure moneymaker and forgotten its original purpose?
Well, first off, I just want to, for the record, we can provide you some expenses that make up why we need the reserve that's been there. Typically, for our franchise fund, sir, we keep 1 to 3 months of operating reserve on task. And again, there's some other expenses there, like you said, outside of salaries, and we're happy to provide and take that for the record. For the supply fund, there is about 6 months of operating reserves. And again, this is information that we can provide to you so that you can get a clearer picture. Now, in relation to Pershing Hall, that is not something that is under our purview today, but we're happy to take this for the record so that we can address your concerns. My main oversight is for the franchise fund and the supply fund, sir.
Wonderful. So will you commit with us today then, Mr. Larkin, that you will get that information and set something up with the committee on Pershing Hall so we can find out exactly what is going on with that property?
We will take that for the record, yes,
Okay.
sir.
And going back to the reserve funds, again, the reserve funds, I truly understand when there's a need for an obligation, but there's not going to be an obligation. If you have a 4-month operating cost, okay, there's not going to be that large of a true obligation because you either have a customer that is having you service their account, so you have revenue in and revenue going out. And if that customer goes away, you're certainly not going to have the obligation for that bill to be paid because that customer is no longer going to be creating that obligation, so you won't have that revenue. So the true obligation and reserves that are necessary for the organization is the salary for the employees. And to have 4 years of salary requirement in reserve, that is far too much money.
So
I yield back.
If I can address that just real quickly, and we'll get you this information, but there are more expenses out there than just salary. We actually have buildings, that we are renting, and there's other overhead that we can definitely be able to explain to you further. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. And I just have a few more questions, so I'll yield a few minutes to myself. Mr. Larkins, why does the VA publish the annual report for the franchise fund but not for the supply fund?
No, thank you for that question. This is actually one of the questions that I asked when I first took this job in 2019. The franchise fund is more of an enterprise business entity, meaning we are actively selling services to not only VA, but to other government agencies, okay? The supply fund is strictly more so with services to VA, right? And so therefore, we don't necessarily put together a public-facing document that's, put out there for everyone to view. But again, we have access, we have this information, and anyone who desires it, we can give them access to that information.
All right, thank you for that. And also for Mr. Larkins, if the committee had not held this hearing, then how would we have found out about the supply fund loss?
It's a good question. We do put this information out there in the audit reports. I think this is a classic thing of, again, like if you ask, we give you the information, but you're right, there's probably other areas where we could provide information on a regular basis if it's required.
Ms. Mata, can you provide an example in which a revolving fund violated the Anti-Deficiency Act?
Yes. The Anti-Deficiency Act requires agencies to have a system of funds control. In fiscal year 2023, the Department of Housing and Urban Development reported to us that they had counted the value of reimbursable agreements that they were anticipating getting and had obligated against those anticipated receipts before they received them. That violated the Anti-Deficiency Act's prohibition against obligations before you receive the amounts. And that violation is in GEO's compilation of ADA reports that we published in December.
Great, thank you. And then, Ms. Riffle, when was the last time that a VA revolving fund violated the Anti-Deficiency Act?
Yeah, I actually am not aware. I'll defer to Mr. Larkins and see if he's aware.
No, from my aware, we have not had an Anti-Deficiency Act within the VA revolving funds.
And Mr. Mervan, you don't have any other questions? I do not. You're good. Okay. Great. I think that's all we have for today. So thank you all for being here today and for answering all of our questions. I ask unanimous consent that all members shall have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material. Hearing no objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.